All right, let's bring in Mike Pompeo, Fox News contributor, former Secretary of State. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning to you all.
We'll start with your reaction on Dr. Fauci and everything that's coming out with him lately. He had his first interview with Nicole Wallace yesterday, and she really didn't grill him about those emails. What's your reaction about these 3,200 pages of emails that BuzzFeed got?
So I've seen some of the emails. What really matters here is when it mattered most, when the Chinese were covering this up in early January of 2020, Dr. Fauci certainly would have seen the same intelligence that I saw. We would certainly have known that the risk that this came from the laboratory was real. We would have known that the Chinese Communist Party didn't want any of us to know that, and that raised red flags throughout the entire United States government for far too long. Dr. Fauci let those of us who are out there talking about it carry the mantle, and we couldn't get science. We got politics instead, and that's what you saw in the left-wing media. You saw politics trumping science, and that delayed our capacity to respond to what the Chinese Communist Party foisted upon the world.
Directly affects our national security. Here's an example of some of the emails that I think are eyebrow-raising. This is an email to Dr. Peter Daszak. This is what he's responding after Anthony Fauci sidelined the talk of a lab leak. Quote, April 18th, 2020. I'm sure you remember this. I just want to say a personal thank you on behalf of our staff and collaborators for publicly standing up and stating that the scientific evidence supports a natural origin from COVID-19 from a bat to a human spillover, not a lab release from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. From my perspective, your comments are brave, and coming from your trusted voice will help dispel the myths being spun around the virus's origins. Now, your job, Secretary of State, knowing that that was going on behind the scenes, Anthony Fauci saying it happened by happenstance, wet market, as opposed to a Wuhan lab, where Tom Cotton was one of the first to say, let's look at that lab.
Yeah, so Senator Cotton got it right. Right after that email that you described in early May, I began to talk about this as well. We knew that the evidence was accumulating, it was piling up, showing that the theory of the wet market didn't hold water, and that the much more likely scenario was that this had come from the virology lab in Wuhan. And this guy Daszak, the fellow that wrote this email, he's got dirty hands. He was involved in this laboratory. There was taxpayer money that was funneled through an alliance that he was responsible for. You know, too, Brian, he was one of the lead investigators that was sent in to take a look at this.
What a joke.
There's a lot of questions to be answered. I think Dr. Fauci has a lot of questions to answer, and this matters. Your point, Brian, about this being about American national security. That lab is still operating. That work is still going on there today, and we could have something like this happen again, and the Chinese Communist Party refused to tell us what they know. The United States, President Biden must demand that we get these answers, and we need to know how the U.S. government, Dr. Fauci, Daszak, all the folks that were involved in underwriting this laboratory, what they knew, when they knew it, because this will help us answer the important questions that will keep us all safe.
Okay, that's the perfect segue to the question I have for you, Mr. Secretary. You've always been a straight shooter. We know there were some behind-the-scenes scuffles between the president and Fauci and you guys. Did y'all know something was going on behind the scenes, that there was this connection back then? What did you guys know at the time?
So I have to be a little careful. You saw, Lawrence, what we were able to release on January 15th. Director Ratcliffe, the head of the DNI at the time, and I had been working for an awfully long time to get as much information released as we possibly could. We knew we could watch all the facts begin to align that suggested that the most likely case. We knew about the doctors. We watched them disappear. Journalists. We knew that people had taken ill in Wuhan. We began to see this evidence accumulate, and we were trying to get it out. We were certainly trying to make sure everybody in the United States government knew,
Mr. Secretary,
so we could respond.
Sorry to interrupt. What prevented you guys from pushing it out, all the information?
Yeah, it's a complicated process, Lawrence. There's still more information that's sitting there that I think ought to be out, but you have sources and methods, intelligence things that need to be protected. I was a director of the CIA. I understand that. But we need to make sure that the American people know everything that we can. And then, frankly, we don't know the answer for sure. We need the Chinese Communist Party to be held accountable.
Will we ever know the answer, the origins of this virus that killed millions of people around the world?
Yeah, I think we will. It may take years and years and years. We know it has already taken too long. The Chinese Communist Party could answer this in 30 seconds if they chose to do so. But I think one day we'll know. Some brave Chinese doctor, some technician will break free, and they'll share the information. We'll be able to validate what happened. We need to get the answer to this question.
Right. I will say this, just in terms of what emails subscribe to what you're saying, this exchange between a scientist, Richard Henderson, to Fauci, he said, unusual features on the virus make up a really small part of the genome, so one has to look at very hard at all the sequences to see that some of the features potentially look engineered. Isn't that nice? So that might have been manufactured and made.
Brian, you know, all these emails that you're seeing now are entirely consistent as well with what the propaganda machine inside of China was pressing and what the World Health Organization was pressing as well. We can't forget that all this time, not only was there an absence of information from the Chinese Communist Party, but Brian, they were trying to tell us that this came from America. They were actively engaged in propaganda, suggesting this was natural. They are hard at it. We've got to hold Chinese Communist Party accountable. I haven't seen any evidence that this administration is prepared to do that. The American people should demand that they be held accountable. There are lots of tools that we can use to do that.
Mr. Secretary, I want to pivot to another issue. Kamala Harris has gone 71 days without a press conference since being tapped to run the border crisis. Now, she'll visit Guatemala on Sunday and Mexico on Monday. We know that you briefed the Biden administration during the transition about how their policy could impact the border, the Remain in Mexico policy. What should she be saying to these countries when she goes to meet with them this upcoming week?
Unfortunately, she's not going to say what needs to be said. What is easy to do is just to go back to the policies that we had in place. Once that they worked, it took us a little while to get them in place, but we'd turned off the magnet. We had prevented this massive humanitarian crisis and this enormous national security crisis from taking place. She should tell them we're going to go back to the policies that we had back in December of last year. This will keep those countries want to keep their people too. They'd like to have their talent stay inside of their country. We need to tell them that this is what they're going to have to do. They're going to have to enforce their own borders, and we're going to enforce ours.
So let's talk about the Russia meeting that's coming up between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin. We keep seeing all these ransomware attacks, and they're being linked to Russia. A reporter was asking Jen Psaki about it in the press room yesterday, and they say that they're not being tested by Putin. Listen to this, and we'll get your reaction.
Mr. President, will you retaliate against Russia for this latest ransomware attack?
We're looking closely at that issue.
Do you think Putin is testing you?
No.
He says Putin's not testing him. What do you say?
No, here's what I can say for sure. These kinds of things in our administration were different in kind, and the responses to Russian activity was different in kind. We didn't give them money. We didn't let them build out their energy pipeline. We provided weapon systems to the Ukrainians to defend themselves. We built out our military. All of these things Vladimir Putin didn't like. And now you see these ransomware attacks. I haven't seen the intelligence, but they have all the hallmarks of having come from Russia. When President Biden meets with President Putin next week, he needs to make clear that there will be real costs, not just on these thugs, these criminals who are engaged in this conduct, but from the people who are supporting it and enabling to, if it in fact is coming from inside of Russia. Vladimir Putin has an awful lot of capacity to control what happens inside of his country, and the leaders of that country need to be held accountable if we continue to have these things which can wreak enormous devastation on our economy.
They said it. They had their undersecretary come out and say, we're going to make things very unpleasant for the president leading up to June 16th. And now they've taken out the MTA through ransomware, JBS, the Colonial Pipeline, and the Massachusetts Steamboat Authority, let alone what just happened with this meat hit in the middle of the country. So this is they will keep getting shots to the forehead, and we don't answer with anything.
Yeah, Brian, these are the ones that we know about that have been made public. Goodness knows how many have taken place inside some private company who just decided to pay the bribe, to pay the ransom to make it go away. We're going to have to impose real costs. We're going to have to defend ourselves. And Brian, we have lots of tools, some of which we can't say much about. But know this, we have lots of tools where we can impose real cost on the Russians and those cyber hackers. We have to do this. This is a sovereignty issue. This is not terribly different from someone who attacks the United States in the ways that we've known as a matter of history, and we need to treat it as just that kind of attack.
Mr. Secretary, we want to pivot to this story right here. Netanyahu rivals agreed to form a new government to oust him. What does this mean for the U.S.-Israel relations? This is Israel's longest-serving prime minister. This is our most trusted ally. Will that relationship and that bond remain with this new government?
Lawrence, I was in Israel this past weekend for 4 days. while this was all taking place. This government is a confusing one that they are trying to form. It's not completely over yet. It's not certain that they will be successful in doing so. You've got Arab parties, you've got hard right party, you've got what would be traditionally the Israeli center-left party. This is going to be really difficult for them to make good decisions, and that's not good. It's not good for the U.S.-Israel relationship. I hope that whatever government gets formed continues to build on this important security relationship. We were such great partners with the Israelis. We've seen what's been happening in Iran and the fact that we were able to isolate them as part of the Abraham Accords. I hope that whatever government ultimately takes place, whatever government forms, that's the Israelis' business, that they'll continue to build out on what we did, which really created more peace, more prosperity, and indeed more stability in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, Benjamin Netanyahu and President Obama famously disliked each other. In fact, President Obama worked behind the scenes, said he wouldn't get reelected, which is unbelievable. And then Joe Biden, with no word yet on how this is going to affect relations. But when you have to make a deal with an Arab sector of the Israeli government, this is unprecedented. So what did they give up? What did they promise?
It'll be interesting to see, Brian, what all deals had to be cut to make this happen. Right, if they don't get it done, there'll be a fifth election. It's kind of messy stuff inside of Israel. But, Brian, we can see what happens when the United States isn't strong. The Iranians will underwrite Hezbollah. We saw what they did when they underwrote Hamas, firing rockets into Tel Aviv, into Jerusalem. American leadership, our partnership with Israel matters an awful lot, and I hope whichever government ultimately gets formed in Israel builds on that.
Thank you so much for being on with us.
Thanks, Secretary.
Thank you all. Have a good morning.
You got it. Crazy time in the world.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.